The thing about being dragged across polished alien marble by creatures that looked like oversized lobsters with superiority complexes was that it really gave a person time to reflect on their life choices. Commander Lyanna had plenty of time to consider exactly how she'd ended up here, wrists bound behind her back, being hauled toward what could generously be called a coliseum, and more accurately described as a monument to alien ego. The Corvathians had built their arena to intimidate. That much was obvious. Towering spires of crystalline architecture stretched toward a purple sky, while holographic displays flickered with what she assumed were either advertisements for snacks or betting odds on her imminent demise. Probably both. Knowing aliens. "Behold!" announced a voice that managed to sound both pompous and nasal, despite coming from a creature that technically had neither a nose nor any reason to be pompous. "The infamous human predator!" Lyanna snorted. Infamous? She'd been a combat medic for 12 years, and the most infamous thing she'd ever done was accidentally use military-grade antiseptic instead of coffee creamer during a particularly long shift. Though, to be fair, that had cleared out the entire mess hall, so maybe it counted. The creature doing the announcing was presumably Grixtal, based on the ornate headpiece that looked like someone had bedazzled a traffic cone and the way other aliens scurried around him like he mattered. He stood on a raised platform overlooking the arena floor, his forearms gesturing dramatically, while his mandibles clicked in what Lyanna was beginning to recognize as the Corvathian equivalent of a smug grin. "Citizens of the Coalition!" Grixtal's voice boomed through speakers that had clearly been designed by someone who thought volume was a substitute for personality. "Today we demonstrate the true nature of these so-called apex predators from the third planet of the Sol system." The crowd roared its approval. Thousands of aliens filled the stadium seats. Corvathians with their chitinous shells and superiority complexes, tall gray Vorthak with their hollow eyes and judgmental stares, and what looked like walking houseplants that somehow managed to radiate smugness, despite being literal vegetables. Lyanna was deposited roughly in the center of the arena, her restraints finally removed. She rubbed her wrists and took stock of her situation. The arena floor was covered in some kind of shock-absorbing material that felt like walking on a trampoline made of disappointment. The walls rose 30 feet on all sides, smooth and unclimbable, with viewing boxes for VIP spectators who wanted a closer look at whatever spectacle was about to unfold. "You see, esteemed beings," Grixatel continued, his voice dripping with the kind of condescension usually reserved for explaining basic concepts to particularly slow children. "Humans believe themselves to be fearsome hunters. They claim to be the dominant species on a death world, a planet so hostile that it breeds creatures of unparalleled savagery." More cheering from the crowd. Someone threw what might have been popcorn, if popcorn were purple and smelled like sulfur. Lyanna cupped her hands around her mouth and shouted back, "Hey, Bugface! Your research department needs a performance review. I'm a medic, not a hunter." This caused a ripple of confused chittering through the crowd. Apparently, the concept of humans who didn't spend their days wrestling bears and eating raw meat was difficult for them to process. Grixtal's mandibles clicked faster, a sure sign of irritation. "Silence, soft skin! Your deceptions will not save you from today's test." He turned back to address the crowd, his forearms now gesticulating wildly. "To prove the cowardice that lurks beneath their supposed ferocity, we have acquired a specimen from the death world Kethmaran." A collective gasp went up from the crowd. Even the houseplants seemed to rustle with anticipation. Behold the juvenile shadow maw. Even as a cub, This creature represents the pinnacle of predatory evolution. Watch as your supposed apex predator reveals her true nature when faced with a real hunter. The arena floor began to rumble, and a section of the wall slid away to reveal a transport cage being wheeled in by a team of nervous-looking Corvathian handlers. The cage was covered by a dark cloth, and whatever was inside was making sounds that could best be described as a mix between a purr and a growl, if purrs could somehow convey existential irritation. Liana had to admit the showmanship was impressive. The lighting dimmed dramatically, spotlights focused on the cage, and ominous music began playing from hidden speakers. It was like the universe's most expensive magic show, if magic shows typically ended with someone being eaten. The Shadow Maw, Grixtal announced with obvious relish, is equipped with crystalline spines that can penetrate standard military armor, 6 powerful limbs capable of crushing bone, and sensory capabilities that make it the perfect killing machine. They hunt in packs on their homeworld, taking down prey 10 times their size through coordinated attacks and ruthless efficiency. The handlers positioned the cage about 20 feet from where Liana stood, then retreated quickly to a safe distance. One of them was actually shaking, which seemed excessive for professionals who presumably worked with dangerous creatures on a regular basis. "Prepare yourself, human," Grixtal called down, his voice now taking on the tone of a carnival barker who'd found his calling in gladiatorial combat. "Face your fears and show us the truth of your species." With a dramatic flourish that involved all 4 of his arms, and what might have been jazz hands if jazz hands were performed by an oversized arthropod, Grixtal triggered the release mechanism. The cloth fell away, the cage door swung open, and nothing happened. For several long seconds, the arena was filled with the kind of silence that usually preceded either enlightenment or catastrophe. The crowd leaned forward in their seats, waiting for the dramatic emergence of a terrifying predator. Instead, what emerged from the cage was approximately the size of a golden retriever, covered in midnight black fur with patches of bioluminescent spots that pulsed gently in the arena lights. It had 6 legs, as advertised, but they were currently being used to perform what could only be described as a luxurious stretch. The crystalline spines running along its back caught the light and sparkled like a disco ball designed by someone with excellent taste in deadly accessories. The creature's head was wolf-like but broader, with large amber eyes that held an intelligence that was both alien and oddly familiar. It yawned, revealing teeth that were certainly sharp enough to be concerning, but the overall effect was somewhat diminished by the fact that it then sat down and began grooming one of its front paws like an oversized cat. The crowd's excited murmur began to fade into confused whispers. Liana tilted her head, studying the creature. "That's it?" she called up to Grixtal. "That's your terrifying apex predator? It's adorable!" The Shadowmaw cub looked up at the sound of her voice, ears perking forward with interest. Its tail, which had been twitching lazily, began to wag. Grixtal's mandibles were now clicking at a frequency that suggested either extreme agitation or an attempt to communicate with nearby insects. It is a juvenile," he sputtered. "Do not be fooled by its appearance. Even young, it possesses all the instincts and capabilities of its species." As if summoned by his words, the Shadowmaw rose to its feet and began moving. The crowd held its collective breath, waiting for the savage attack that would vindicate their preconceptions about Death World predators. The cub walked straight past the spot where a proper predator would have begun stalking its prey, ignored the various defensive positions Liana might have taken, and proceeded directly to where she stood in the center of the arena. Then it sat down at her feet, looked up at her with those intelligent amber eyes, and made a sound that was unmistakably a greeting chirp. "Oh, for crying out loud," Lyanna muttered, then crouched down to get a better look at her supposed nemesis. "Hello there, little guy. You're not exactly what they advertised, are you?" The thing about apex predators, Lyanna reflected as the Shadowmaw cub proceeded to flop over and expose its belly for scratches, was that apparently nobody had bothered to explain the concept to this particular specimen. The crowd's confusion was palpable. Thousands of aliens who had paid good money to watch a human get mauled were instead witnessing what appeared to be the galaxy's most anticlimactic meet and cute. The creature had not only failed to attack, it was now making a sound that could generously be called purring, and more accurately described as a small engine with contentment issues. This is not. Grixtal's voice cracked over the arena speakers, his usual pompous confidence replaced by the kind of bewilderment typically reserved for finding out your carefully planned surprise party was actually a tax audit. Lyanna couldn't help herself. She reached down and gave the cub's exposed belly a gentle scratch, which resulted in an immediate increase in the purring volume and what she could swear was a look of bliss on the creature's alien features. "Oh, you're just a big softy, aren't you?" she cooed, her voice carrying clearly in the stunned silence of the arena. "Yes, you are." "Yes, you are." The collective intake of breath from the crowd suggested that baby talk was not what they'd expected from this encounter. "Silence!" Grixtal's voice boomed, all four arms now waving frantically. "Guards, separate them at once! The human must be using some form of chemical manipulation." Several Corvathian guards began moving toward the arena floor, their weapons drawn but held uncertainly. It was hard to look menacing when approaching what appeared to be an impromptu petting session. The Shadowmaw's response to the approaching guards was immediate and decisive. It rolled upright, positioning itself between Lyanna and the advancing aliens, and produced a sound that was decidedly less cute than its previous purring. This was a growl with substance, the kind of vocalization that spoke of evolutionary advantages earned through successful violence. The guards stopped as if they'd hit an invisible wall. "Interesting," Lyanna murmured, staying crouched beside the cub. She'd noticed something during her brief examination, and now she took a closer look. The creature's fur was patchy in places, showing old scars beneath. Its frame was leaner than it should be for a predator cub, and there was a wariness in its eyes that spoke of bad experiences with captivity. "You've been through hell, haven't you, little one?" she said softly, running her fingers gently along the creature's flank. She could feel healed fractures in what she assumed were ribs, and there were marks around its neck that looked suspiciously like restraint burns. The cub leaned into her touch, amber eyes closing briefly in what looked like relief. When it opened them again, it looked directly at her face and made a soft, questioning sound. "Yeah, I know the feeling," Lyanna replied, her voice pitched for the creature's ears rather than the crowd. "Stuck somewhere you don't want to be, surrounded by idiots who think they know what you are." She reached into the small survival kit she'd managed to keep despite her capture. Military-grade medkits were designed to handle a variety of species, and while she'd never treated a Shadowmaw before, mammals were mammals across most of the galaxy. She pulled out a small container of antiseptic gel and began treating some of the more recent abrasions on the creature's hide. The cub held perfectly still during this process, watching her face with an intensity that spoke of intelligence far beyond what the arena crowd had expected. When she finished, it licked her hand once, gently, then climbed into her lap and settled there as if it had found exactly where it belonged. "Oh, come on," Lyanna said, though she was smiling. You can't be serious. The shadow maw yawned, revealing those impressive teeth again, then tucked its head against her shoulder and closed its eyes. The purring resumed, now accompanied by the kind of boneless relaxation that cats throughout the galaxy had perfected as a form of protest against being moved. The arena had gone so quiet that Lyanna could hear individual conversations in the stands. Most of them seemed to involve variations on "What in the blazes is happening down there?" expressed in various alien languages and several creative combinations of profanity. "This is impossible!" Grixtal's voice cut through the murmur, now pitched high enough to suggest that his carefully planned spectacle was causing him genuine distress. "Shadow maws are pack hunters, territorial, aggressive. They don't do that." Lyanna looked up at the announcer's booth, her arms instinctively adjusting to better support the creature in her lap. "Maybe you should have done better research," she called back. "Pack hunters means they're social, genius. They bond with their pack mates. And territorial means they protect what they consider theirs." She felt the cub's purring intensify at the sound of her voice, and she couldn't help but smile. "Looks like I just got adopted." "Preposterous," Grixtal sputtered. "It's a wild animal, a killing machine." "It's a baby," Lyanna replied flatly. "A traumatized baby that's been kept in a cage and probably hasn't had a kind word or gentle touch since it was taken from its pack." Her voice hardened as she looked around the arena. What kind of monsters steal cubs from their families? A ripple of uncomfortable shifting ran through the crowd. Apparently, even beings who enjoyed gladiatorial combat had limits when it came to child endangerment. The shadow maw opened one amber eye and looked at her, then made a small sound that could have been agreement. It shifted position slightly, getting more comfortable, and Lyanna realized with a mixture of amusement and exasperation that the creature had no intention of moving anytime soon. "You know," she said conversationally, loud enough for her voice to carry to the stands, "on my world, we have creatures called dogs, domestic predators that chose to live with humans because we offered them something better than the wild: protection, regular meals, companionship." She scratched behind one of the cub's ears, which resulted in an immediate increase in purring and what looked suspiciously like a smile. "They're loyal, intelligent, and absolutely devastating in a fight when they need to be. But most of the time, they're content to be part of the family." The cub opened both eyes and looked up at her, then made a soft chirping sound that seemed almost conversational. "Oh, you want to join the discussion?" Lyanna asked, grinning. "What do you think about all this?" She gestured toward the crowd with her free hand. The shadow maw looked toward the stands, then back at her, and made a sound that was unmistakably dismissive. If disdain could be vocalized by a six-legged predator cub, that would have been it. Lyanna burst out laughing. "My thoughts exactly." "Enough!" Grixtal's voice cracked like a whip over the arena speakers. "Guards, use the sonic disruptors. Separate them by force if necessary." The Korvathian guards raised their weapons, but the moment the first sonic pulse activated, the shadow maw's demeanor changed completely. The purring stopped, replaced by a snarl that seemed to come from something much larger and more dangerous than the creature currently occupying Lyanna's lap. The cub rose to its feet, placing itself protectively in front of her, and for the first time since emerging from its cage, it looked every inch the apex predator its species was supposed to be. Its crystalline spines began to glow with an inner light, its muscles bunched with coiled power, and its amber eyes fixed on the guards with the kind of focus that prey animals recognized on a genetic level. "Stand down!" Lyanna called to the guards, one arm extended protectively toward the cub. "You're just making it worse." But the Shadow Maw had already made its decision. It looked back at her once, amber eyes conveying a message as clear as words. "Stay behind me." Then it turned to face the guards and let out a roar that belonged to something much larger than a dog-sized cub. The sound echoed through the arena with enough force to rattle the viewing boxes and send several spectators scrambling backward in their seats. The guards stopped advancing. Several of them took involuntary steps backward. "Well," Lyanna said, settling back on her heels and watching her unlikely protector with a mixture of admiration and concern. "I guess we're doing this the hard way." The standoff that followed was the kind of tense moment that made for excellent holodrama, assuming anyone survived to film the sequel. On one side, a dozen heavily armed Corvathian guards with sonic disruptors, and what Lyanna assumed was standard riot control gear. On the other side, one human medic and a Shadow Maw cub that was currently demonstrating why its species had earned the apex predator designation despite being roughly the size of a medium dog. The cub's crystalline spines were now fully extended, creating a crown of glowing spikes that cast prismatic light across the arena floor. Its 6 legs were positioned for maximum stability and spring potential, and the sound it was making had evolved from a simple growl into something that seemed to bypass the ears entirely and speak directly to the part of the brain responsible for recognizing imminent doom. "Fascinating," Lyanna murmured, her military xenobiology training finally kicking in properly. "You're not just protecting me, are you? You're establishing pack hierarchy." The cub glanced back at her briefly, amber eyes bright with intelligence, then returned its attention to the guards. The message was clear. She was pack now, and pack was defended. Grixtal's voice crackled over the speakers, now pitched high enough to suggest genuine panic. "What are you waiting for? Subdue them both. Use maximum force if necessary." "Maybe we should try minimum force first," one of the guards suggested, his voice carrying clearly in the arena's acoustics. "You know, just as a radical experiment in not getting eaten by an angry predator." "It's a juvenile," Grixtal shrieked. "How dangerous could it possibly be?" As if summoned by his words, the Shadow Maw demonstrated exactly how dangerous it could be by moving. One moment, it was standing protectively in front of Lyanna. The next, it was airborne, covering the 20-foot distance to the nearest guard in a single leap that defied several laws of physics and at least one law of common sense. The guard went down with a crash that echoed through the arena, his weapons skittering across the floor. The cub landed gracefully on his chest, all 6 feet finding purchase, and brought its face close to his helmet in what could generously be called an aggressive sniff, and more accurately described as a preview of what his last few seconds of life might look like. Then it licked the helmet's faceplate once, almost gently, and bounded back to Lyanna's side. The guard lay still for several seconds, presumably processing the fact that he was still alive, before scrambling backward with the kind of speed usually reserved for emergency evacuations. "Good boy," Lyanna said, scratching behind the cub's ears. "Very restrained. I'm proud of you." The Shadow Maw preened under the praise, its spines dimming slightly as it settled back into protective position. "This is impossible." Grixtal's voice had now achieved frequencies that were probably causing distress to nearby small animals. "Shadow Maws don't show restraint. They don't demonstrate mercy. They're killing machines." Lyanna stood slowly, keeping one hand on the cub's back. "That's where you're wrong," she called up to the announcer's booth, her voice carrying clearly through the arena. "I've been studying your research for the past few minutes, and frankly, your Xenobiology department needs to go back to school." She gestured toward her companion, who was now sitting at heel like the galaxy's most dangerous therapy animal. "Shadow Maws are pack hunters, right? That means they're highly social. They have complex communication systems, emotional bonds, and behavioral hierarchies. You can't just throw one into an arena and expect it to attack randomly." The crowd was listening now, their bloodthirsty enthusiasm replaced by something approaching curiosity. Educational content wasn't what they'd paid for, but it was certainly more interesting than watching guards run away from a cub. "Furthermore," Lyanna continued, warming to her subject, "this little guy isn't just any shadow maw. Look at the pattern of bioluminescent spots along his spine, the specific arrangement of his crystalline spines, the bone structure of his skull." She knelt beside the cub, who obligingly turned to show off his profile. "These markings indicate high genetic status. This isn't some random predator you captured. This is pack royalty, probably the offspring of an alpha pair." A ripple of surprised murmurs ran through the crowd. Even the houseplants seemed to rustle with interest. Grixtal's mandibles were clicking so fast they sounded like an old-fashioned typewriter. That's impossible to determine from visual observation alone." "Is it?" Lyanna smiled grimly. "I'm a combat medic with Xenobiology certification. I've studied the anatomy and behavioral patterns of over 200 alien species. It's literally my job to know this stuff." She stood again, her hand never leaving the cub's back. "And here's something else your research team missed. Shadow Maw cubs don't reach emotional maturity until they're 3 standard years old. Before that, they're essentially blank slates, ready to imprint on whatever pack structure they encounter." The cub looked up at her and made a soft chirping sound that sounded almost like agreement. "That's right," she said, scratching his ears. "You've been looking for a pack leader this whole time, haven't you? Someone who'd treat you with respect instead of keeping you in a cage." "Preposterous," Grixtal sputtered. "Even if that were true, it would only prove that humans are weak-willed creatures who form inappropriate emotional attachments." The crowd's murmur turned distinctly less friendly. Apparently, even alien spectators had limits when it came to insulting successful interspecies bonding. Lyanna's smile turned sharp. "Inappropriate emotional attachments? You mean like the kind that turn random individuals into coordinated teams? The kind that allow different species to work together toward common goals? The kind that built every successful civilization in known space?" She gestured toward the viewing boxes where the VIP spectators sat. "Tell me, Grixtal, how many species are represented in your precious coalition? And how many of those alliances were formed through mutual respect and cooperation rather than conquest and intimidation?" The announcer's booth went noticeably quiet. "Because here's the thing about humans," Lyanna continued, her voice carrying to every corner of the arena. "We don't just adapt to hostile environments. We adapt to hostile people. We find ways to cooperate with beings that have nothing in common with us except the desire to survive and thrive." The cub had been listening to this speech with obvious interest, his head tilting at her tone changes and his tail wagging slightly whenever her voice took on particular emphasis. Now he stood and moved to her side, pressing against her leg in a gesture of solidarity. "We take scared, traumatized individuals," she said, looking down at her companion with obvious affection. "And we give them a family, a purpose, a chance to be something more than what others expect them to be." She looked up at Grixtal's booth, her expression hardening. "Which is more than I can say for beings who steal babies from their families and throw them into arenas for entertainment." The crowd's murmur had turned into something approaching outright dissent. Beings who had come to see a spectacle were now questioning the ethics of that spectacle, and they were not pleased with the answers they were finding. "Enough!" Grixtal's voice cracked like a whip. "Guards! Use lethal force if necessary. End this mockery." The remaining guards raised their weapons, but their movements were hesitant. Public opinion had shifted, and even heavily armed aliens could read a crowd. The Shadow Maw read the situation differently. The moment the weapons were raised, his playful demeanor vanished completely. The purring stopped, the tail wagging ceased, and suddenly Lyanna was standing next to something that looked every inch the apex predator his species was renowned for being. His crystalline spines flared to full extension, casting rainbow patterns across the arena walls. His muscles bunched with contained power, and when he opened his mouth, the sound that emerged was no longer a cute growl or playful snarl. It was a roar that belonged to something much larger, much older, and much more dangerous than anything that should have fit in a transport cage. The sound echoed through the arena with enough force to crack the lower viewing windows and send several spectators diving for cover. "Well," Lyanna said calmly, reaching down to rest her hand on the cub's back, "I guess you've decided you're done playing nice?" The Shadow Maw looked up at her, amber eyes blazing with protective fury, and made a sound that was unmistakably a question. "Yeah," she said, checking her medical kit and mentally cataloging what could be weaponized if necessary. "I think it's time to show them what a real pack looks like." The guards were clearly having second thoughts about their career choices. Several had lowered their weapons entirely, while others held them with the kind of reluctance usually reserved for handling live explosives. The smart ones were already backing toward the exits. "You know what the really funny thing is?" Lyanna called up to Grixtal, her voice carrying easily through the suddenly tense arena. "You actually got one part right. Shadow Maws are incredibly dangerous when they need to be. The problem is, you completely misunderstood what would trigger that response." The cub beside her was still radiating menace, but she could feel the controlled precision in his posture. This wasn't mindless aggression. This was a calculated threat display from an apex predator who understood exactly what he was doing. "See, you thought putting him in an arena with a human would trigger his hunting instincts," she continued, one hand still resting on the cub's back, where she could feel the tension coiled in his muscles. "But predators don't just hunt. They protect. They defend territory. They maintain pack hierarchy." She took a step forward, and the Shadow Maw moved with her, perfectly synchronized. "And right now, I'm his pack, which means threatening me was probably the single worst decision you could have made." A new voice cut through the arena's tension, crisp and authoritative. "Stand down, all units. Weapons to safe positions, immediately." Every head in the arena turned toward the source of the command. In the VIP section, a tall figure in elegant robes was rising from her seat. She had the elongated limbs and silvery skin of a high-ranking Altarian, and the kind of presence that made even Grixtal's mandibles stop their nervous clicking. "Ambassador Kethran!" Grixtal's voice cracked with what might have been relief or terror. "I didn't realize you were in attendance. This demonstration was specifically designed to demonstrate the fundamental ignorance of our intelligence services," Kethran interrupted smoothly, "and to provide compelling evidence that our current approach to human evaluation is not only flawed, but actively counterproductive." The ambassador stepped forward to the edge of her viewing box, her gaze sweeping across the arena floor. "What I'm witnessing here is not the cowardice or weakness that your reports suggested we would find in human behavior," Instead, I'm seeing adaptive problem-solving, interspecies empathy, and the kind of tactical thinking that turns isolated individuals into coordinated teams. She gestured toward Liana and the Shadow Maw. In less than one standard hour, this human has not only established communication with a supposedly untrainable predator, she has earned its loyalty and protection. More than that, she has correctly identified genetic markers that our own xenobiologists missed, diagnosed, and treated injuries that our handlers ignored, and demonstrated a level of behavioral understanding that exceeds our current scientific literature. The crowd was hanging on every word now, their entertainment-seeking mood replaced by something approaching academic fascination. Furthermore, Catherine continued, her voice carrying the weight of diplomatic authority, she has done all of this while maintaining ethical standards that put our own practices to shame. She treated a wounded creature with compassion, recognized signs of abuse and trauma, and provided care without expectation of reward. Liana felt her cheeks warm slightly. She hadn't expected her impromptu veterinary work to become the subject of interstellar political commentary. The Shadow Maw, sensing the shift in mood, had relaxed his aggressive posture slightly, though his crystalline spines remained extended and his amber eyes continued to track the positions of every guard in the arena. This entire spectacle, Catherine said, her tone taking on the kind of diplomatic disapproval that could end careers, was designed to demonstrate human inadequacy. Instead, it has revealed our own. We captured a juvenile member of a sapient species, traumatized it through improper containment, and then attempted to use it as a weapon against an individual whose only crime was defending her people's interests. Grixtal's mandibles had gone completely still, which Liana was beginning to suspect was the Corvathian equivalent of a deer caught in headlights. The question now, Catherine said, her gaze settling on Liana with something that might have been respect, is what we do with this information. The Shadow Maw made a soft, questioning sound, looking up at Liana as if asking whether the danger had passed. She scratched behind his ears, feeling the tension in his muscles beginning to ease. "Well," she said, loud enough for her voice to carry to the ambassador's box. "For starters, someone needs to explain to your Xenobiology department that stealing babies is generally considered poor form by most civilized species." A ripple of what might have been laughter ran through the crowd. "After that," she continued, settling into a more comfortable stance now that immediate violence seemed less likely, "maybe we could discuss better methods for first contact that don't involve gladiatorial combat and traumatized wildlife." The cub made an agreeable chirping sound and settled into a more relaxed position, though his eyes remained alert and his spines stayed partially extended. He was clearly willing to trust her judgment, but he wasn't taking any chances. Ambassador Catherine descended from her viewing box with the kind of graceful authority that suggested she was accustomed to making dramatic entrances at precisely the right moment. The crowd parted before her like water, and even the remaining guards seemed to shrink back as she approached the arena floor. "Commander Liana," she said, her voice carrying easily across the space between them. "That is your rank, correct?" "Commander, Human Defense Corps, Xenobiology Division." Liana blinked in surprise. "How did you?" "Yes, that's correct. Though I'm curious how you know that, when your intelligence services apparently thought I was some kind of berserker warrior." The ambassador's expression might have been a smile, if Altarians smiled the same way humans did. "Because, Commander, this entire scenario was not quite what it appeared to be." The Shadow Maw cub tilted his head, amber eyes shifting between Liana and the approaching diplomat, with the kind of alert interest that suggested he was following the conversation despite the language barriers. "You see," Cathran continued, stepping onto the arena floor with practiced ease, "there has been considerable debate within the coalition regarding humanity's application for membership. Some factions, represented by individuals like Grixtal here, believe humans are nothing more than violent primitives who happen to develop space travel." Grixtal's mandibles clicked weakly from his booth, but he seemed to have lost his voice entirely. "Other factions," the ambassador said, moving closer, "believe that humanity represents exactly the kind of adaptive, cooperative intelligence that the coalition needs. The kind of species that can form bonds across genetic and cultural barriers, find common ground with beings that share nothing but mutual goals, and solve problems through innovation rather than force." Lyanna felt a sinking suspicion beginning to form in her stomach. This was a test. In part, yes. Catherine stopped about 10 feet away, well within the Shadowmaw's protective radius, but clearly not considering herself a threat. "Though I must admit, the results have exceeded even our most optimistic projections." The cub made a soft, questioning sound, looking up at Lyanna as if asking whether this new development was good or bad. She scratched behind his ears absently, her mind racing through the implications. So, the capture, the arena, the whole gladiatorial spectacle. Was Grixtal's contribution to what was supposed to be a controlled evaluation scenario? Catherine said dryly. The original plan called for a simple diplomatic meeting with a minor stress component to evaluate human adaptability under pressure. Grixtal decided to enhance the drama. A collective murmur of disapproval rose from the crowd. Apparently, even beings who enjoyed blood sports had standards about informed consent. The Shadowmaw cub, however, the ambassador continued, was always part of the plan, though not quite in the way it was implemented. She gestured toward Lyanna's companion, who was now sitting alertly at her side, crystalline spines dim but still extended enough to catch the arena lights. "Meet Kexhai, offspring of the Shadowmaw matriarch who leads the largest pack on Kethmaran." He volunteered for this assignment. Lyanna stared at the cub, at Kexhai, with new understanding. "Volunteered? You mean he's been working with you this whole time?" The Shadowmaw made a sound that could have been confirmation, then looked up at her with what she was now certain was amusement in his amber eyes. "Shadowmaws," Catherine explained, "are not just apex predators. They're also remarkably intelligent social creatures with a sophisticated understanding of political alliances. When we approached the matriarch about this evaluation, she suggested that the best way to test human pack bonding capabilities would be to see how your species responded to one of their young." Kexhai stood and padded over to the ambassador, who reached down to scratch behind his ears with obvious familiarity. He purred contentedly for a moment, then returned to Lyanna's side and settled against her legs with the clear message that his loyalties had been decided. "The original scenario," Catherine continued, "called for a controlled meeting in a neutral environment. Kexahai was supposed to evaluate your species' potential for interspecies cooperation and report back to his matriarch. The gladiatorial arena and the terrifying predator narrative were entirely Grixtal's additions. So when he climbed into my lap and refused to leave," Lyanna said slowly, "he was making his assessment and his choice," the ambassador confirmed. "Shadowmaw pack structure is based on competence, compassion, and loyalty. Kexhai recognized all three qualities in you within minutes of your first interaction." The cub made an agreeable chirping sound and pressed closer to Lyanna's legs, clearly pleased with his decision-making skills. But there's more, Catherine said, her tone taking on the kind of gravity usually reserved for treaty negotiations. Kexhai isn't just any Shadow Maw cub. He's the designated heir to his mother's pack leadership. His choice of pack allegiance carries significant political weight on Kethmaran. Lyanna felt her eyebrows climb toward her hairline. Political weight how, exactly? By bonding with you, he's essentially declaring that humans are suitable alliance partners for Shadowmaw packs. That carries implications for interspecies cooperation that extend far beyond simple coalition membership. The crowd's murmur had shifted again, now carrying undertones of excitement and speculation. Political drama was apparently as entertaining as gladiatorial combat, with the added benefit that fewer people got eaten. Furthermore, the ambassador continued, his assessment of your character and capabilities will influence not only his mother's pack, but the entire Shadowmaw political structure. They take the judgment of their heirs very seriously. Kexhai preened under the attention, his tail wagging slightly as he looked up at Lyanna with obvious pride in his own importance. "So, what happens now?" Lyanna asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Now," Catherine said, her tone taking on the formal cadences of diplomatic procedure, "the Coalition formally invites humanity to join our alliance as full members, with all the rights and responsibilities that entails. Your species has demonstrated exactly the qualities we value most: adaptability, empathy, and the ability to form meaningful connections across species barriers." She gestured toward Grixtal's booth, where the announcer was conspicuously absent. "As for those who believed humans were nothing more than violent primitives, I believe today's demonstration has provided sufficient counter-evidence." The crowd erupted in cheers that echoed through the arena with enough force to rattle the viewing boxes. Apparently, successful diplomatic outcomes were popular entertainment after all. "There is one more thing," Catherine added, raising her voice to carry over the celebration. "Kexhai has made his choice of pack leader clear. Coalition protocol requires that we respect Shadowmaw political decisions, which means you now have an official diplomatic partner for all future interspecies negotiations." Lyanna looked down at the cub, who was sitting proudly at her feet with the unmistakable air of a creature who had successfully manipulated an entire political process to get exactly what he wanted. "You planned this, didn't you?" she asked him. "The whole pathetic injured cub routine, the purring and the belly rubs and the climbing into my lap. That was all calculated." Kexahai's response was a sound that could generously be called innocent, and more accurately described as smug satisfaction given voice. "Well," Lyanna said, reaching down to scratch behind his ears, "I guess I've been adopted by the galaxy's most politically connected predator. Could be worse." She looked up at Ambassador Kethran, who was watching their interaction with obvious approval. "So, when do we start?" "Immediately," the ambassador replied. "The Coalition has several ongoing diplomatic challenges that could benefit from the human perspective on interspecies cooperation, and Kexhai's presence will ensure that our negotiations have the full backing of the Shadowmaw political structure." As if summoned by the mention of his importance, Kexhai stood and moved to Lyanna's side, pressing against her leg in a gesture that was both affectionate and possessive. His message was clear. They were pack now, and pack meant permanent. "Just one question," Lyanna said, as they began walking toward the arena exit, the crowd still cheering around them. "Does this mean I get diplomatic immunity, or do I still have to worry about being thrown into arenas by overzealous administrators?" Catherine's laugh carried the kind of genuine amusement that suggested Lyanna was going to fit in just fine with coalition politics. "Commander, after today's performance, I suspect arena administrators will be more worried about you throwing them into the ring." Kexhai made a sound that was unmistakably agreement, his crystalline spines catching the arena lights one last time, as they walked toward their new future together. Behind them, the crowd continued to cheer, celebrating not just a successful diplomatic breakthrough, but the beginning of an alliance that would reshape the galaxy's understanding of what it meant to be Pax.